Welcome back. Before we start learning about Redux, we need to talk about something called state management. We've heard this word before, state, right? When building a React app, we had this.state. And state described what our app should look like. If we remember this, well, React is simply a group of components that are rendered in a tree-like structure. So this would be the app.js, for example. And each one of these components would have state. For example, the red dots over here, they have state. So for example, this app component will have a state of signed in as, and let's say the state is user. In that case, this user component might have a state of user Mitch. Or if signed in as is admin, it might render the admin component. And anytime you see the blue dot, that means there was a change. So if there's a change here, it can update something into this component and re-render. And we did this in React. And I want you to think of state as memory. An app needs to remember things in order to work. Otherwise, we would just have simple HTML web pages like before. Remember this Keiko Corp website? This really doesn't have any state, does it? Each time, we show the exact same web page to whoever is using it. This page has no idea of who the user is or any interactions that I'm having. It's mainly just text. Now the RoboFriends app, that's different. It has state. Well, mostly because we wrote it and we had the this.state, but we can interact with it. I can type in here Leanne, and I have a state of the search box having LEA in it, and the robots being filtered with just Leanne. State describes how our app should look. Our app, our RoboFriends app right now, should look like this with just one robot card because the state is of a search box having the letters LEA inside of it. Now, with a simple app like the RoboFriends app, state was pretty easy to understand. But state management is a really hard problem as our apps get bigger and bigger and bigger. And you'll actually see in the later part of the course when we start working on the SmartBrain app, which does the image recognition, you'll notice how the state gets more and more complicated and your head starts to hurt because you have to keep track of all these things happening. So again, with a simple React app, we can have nice views and maybe have different states and different components. But eventually, as our app gets bigger, we end up with something like this, where we have more and more components, more and more state within that component, or we can have one massive state at the very top here, which also gets pretty hard. And all these blue dots, as they update, they also have to update the state and then re-render. And this example over here is just a little diagram, but you can see with all these arrows how confusing it's going to get, and keeping track of all this state is really, really hard. So we need some form of a state management. And Redux solved this problem for us. How can we make this diagram simpler and make things easier to understand in our heads as developers? Redux came up with a novel concept. What if we just remove all the state, so this.state, from all the components? What if we just have props? So all these components just have props being passed down. And now the state, we keep it in a store. And a store is simply just the state, which is this.state that React had, but in one massive object, just like you see here. So one single object that describes how our app should look, and all we do is just pass down that state to whichever component needs it as props. So our diagram from looking like this with just React can go to looking like this with Redux, where none of the components need to hold state anymore, and we can have one massive object that describes our entire app, and whichever component needs that prop can just be passed down to it. And any updates that happen go through the state gets modified, and then we pass down that information to the component. This diagram might be confusing without actually coding anything, and we'll come back to it so this makes sense. But even just visually, you can see that this diagram looks a lot simpler than the diagram before it. We have a lot less arrows and everything just flows nicer. So as we go through the videos, you're going to get more and more familiar with this idea of state management. But I want you to keep in mind that that is what Redux is solving. Redux is a library that makes state management easier, not only for React, but for any tools that we use. It just happens to work really, really well with React. And Redux actually got inspiration from database design, from things such as event sourcing or CQRS, which you can read up more on. Databases had the same problem. All these updates and all these changes happened, but we needed a way to make sure that all these changes are organized in a nice, cohesive way. All right, let's get into the next video and get a little bit deeper with Redux. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.